Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this lesson, things are going to start getting a little more interesting. First, I'm going to demonstrate how to accept input into a Windows console application. And then based on the user's input, we're going to write some logic to execute either one block of code or another. All right, and then I'm going to demonstrate two different ways of accomplishing this. There are actually several different ways, and we'll come back to this notion a little bit later in this series of videos. So let's go ahead and get started by creating a new project. I'm going to go to File, New Project. In the New Project dialog, I'll make sure to select a Visual Basic Console application. You should be getting familiar with this technique now. In the future, I'm not going to go through this step. Okay? We'll call this Decisions and click the OK button. Alright, so the first order of business is to make sure that we understand how to retrieve information that a user types into the Windows console. So let's go ahead and make some space for ourselves. I'm going to start typing. Remember, if you want to follow along and if you need to catch up to me, you can pause or rewind the video. All right? Alright, so before I explain what's going on here, let's briefly run the application by clicking the Start Debugging button on the toolbar. And so it prompts us to type something in and press the Enter key. So I'll just type in the word Bob and click Enter. And it just repeats back to me exactly whatever I typed. Excellent. So let's take a look at this example. The key is on line number 8. Now previously, whenever we have used the readline method of the console class, we did so in order to stop the execution of the console window so that it wouldn't just disappear from sight. We'd be able to actually take a moment, read whatever was printed to screen, and then at our discretion hit the Enter key on the keyboard to dismiss the console window. However, you can see it has another function as well, which is to retrieve values that were typed in by the end user. And so then we can evaluate whatever was typed in. In this case, we're merely taking that value into a variable called user value and then concatenating it to a literal string and then printing it to the console window using a write line method. So let's now make this example a little bit more interesting by commenting out the work that we've done up to now and starting with a new example that will evaluate whatever was typed in by the user to make a decision. All right, so here we go. Okay, so let's run the application and see if it works. So for the first test case, we're just going to type in the number 1, and we would expect to see you want a new car. And indeed, that is what we see. Now, what happens if we were to run the application a second time and type in the number 2 or any other character on the keyboard? It would just end the application. And so the key here again is that we're retrieving the information using a read line and then evaluating whatever the user typed in. Whatever the user typed in will be, you can see, returned as a string, so we'll be evaluating the number 1 in quotation marks. Secondly, we use an if-then statement. So if this expression which will evaluate to either true or false. It'll either be 1 or it won't be 1. If it is 1, then execute this block of code defined between the if and if statement. Okay? So let's go ahead and expand this example. What if somebody types in the number 2 or 3, or if they type in something completely, crazy like the letter P? Okay, what happens then? Well, let's go ahead and expand this example. All right, so let's go ahead and save our project. We haven't done that just yet. I clicked on the Save All button in the toolbar, which opens up the Save Project dialog. Again, this is something you should be familiar with, and I won't take this step every time, or at least explain it every time. I'll click the Save button on the Save Project dialog. Now let's run our application. All right, so let's test our first case, number 1, and that seems to work. Let's run the application a second time. This time we'll type in the number 2. It says you want a new boat. Great. Let's see what happens if we type in number 3. You want a cat. Okay. And then finally, let's type in the letter P. Sorry, we didn't understand your response. You lose. All right. So the key to the second iteration of our example here is the use of the else if. So here we're testing the first case using the if keyword. So if this is true, then execute this block of code. However, if this is true, then execute this next block of code. Else, if those aren't true, if this is true, where user value equals 3, then execute this block of code. Else, if none of these are true, then execute this final block of code. This is the catch-all condition, where if anything else doesn't fit into one of these little condition that we're checking for, then this will always work. Okay? All right, so it might seem like we've completed our objective and we can move on. However, oftentimes developers want to write concise code. This often improves the readability by removing extraneous characters. Also, developers have learned that if they find themselves writing the same code more than once, it might be a good idea to take a closer look at that code and see how you can optimize it or refactor the code. Refactoring, admittedly, is a more advanced topic. Entire books have been written about improving the quality of the code by applying some rules designed to improve its quality. Some of these refactorings even have names, and they're integrated right into Visual Studio. But in this case, we can see that each code block in our if-then statement has essentially the same commands. It has a console.writeLine command and a console.readLine command. We simply need to extract what is common and focus on what is different in each of these code blocks. So let's take a moment and refactor the code that we've already written. I'm going to start by extracting what's common. So I'm going to copy and paste this code to the very bottom, and I'll remove the literal string. Secondly, what I'm going to do is dimension another variable called message. That's what's different between each of these versions, each of these code blocks. So now what I'll do is create message equals, and I'm just going to copy that in and paste it into each of the code blocks. Next, what I'll do is then extract out each of those literal strings and set those equal to message. Now I'll clean up the console.read line and console.write line. And finally, I'll add the message variable to our write line statement. So you can see that I have dramatically reduced the amount of code that we needed to type. I could probably reduce it a little bit further if I really thought hard enough. Let's go ahead and make sure that this still works, and we'll just do a simple test case. We'll just type in the number 2, and it seems to work just fine. All right, so one last thing about the if, then, else if, else, and end if keywords and operators is that you need to memorize this syntax. It needs to be as familiar to you as typing any combination of words that make up a sentence in the English language, okay? You'll only memorize if you get your hands dirty and you write a lot of code. So I encourage you to do that. Follow along with these examples, come up with your own. So the beauty of the code that I just demonstrated is that it's very flexible. You can test a lot of different cases. But what if you just need to test an either-or case and you need it a little bit more concise? Well, there's a function in Visual Basic called if, I-I-F. Okay, I guess is how you would pronounce it. And it might work well and fit if we just need to compare whether it's this or that. And so let me go ahead and write a quick example of this. I'll comment out almost everything here. So we'll still use lines 12 and 14, and I'll just go below them. Alright, so let's see how this works. Probably need to change that message, but I'll leave it for now. And so let's run it now and type in the letter P. You get the consolation prize, a cat. So the key here is this IIF, which, as you can see, helps as returns one of two objects depending on the evaluation of an expression. So here is the expression we are evaluating. Is this true or false? Either user value is equal to 1 or it's not. If it is, then set the value of message to the literal string car. If user value is not equal to 1, then set the value of message to the word cat. So it's either going to be car if user value is true, or if user value equals 1 is true, or if it's not true, then you'll set it to this second argument, cat. Then we simply take whatever was returned and we use this syntax, and I'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about strings and how to substitute values into a literal string using this open curly bracket, close curly bracket syntax and a number in between. So open curly brace or bracket 0, close curly brace or bracket, and then comma message. And so that's what substitute the word car or cat into our string, and it gets written out to the console window. And so while it might look a little confusing at first, it's really not that bad. The IntelliSense helps you remember each of the arguments into the if function. It's better than writing the following 5 lines or 6 lines of code like I've pasted into the code window here. This one statement replaces all of these lines of code. All right, so we definitely want to keep this in our bag of tricks. It's a great way to do inline conditional checking, especially the way that we've used it here to assign a value to a variable without having to write several lines of code. So just to recap, the key idea from this lesson is how to write conditional logic within Visual Basic, and we demonstrated two constructs. First of all, we use the if statement to evaluate conditions, some expression whether it equates to true or false, and then we added to its utility by demonstrating the use of the else if and the else statements to account for additional scenarios that you might need to handle within your code. And then secondly, we demonstrated the use of the if conditional function for simple scenarios like we demonstrated here, where it can either be one or the other. There's also a third way to write conditional logic using the Visual Basic select case statement, and we're going to cover that in a lesson much later in this video series. So hang in there, you're doing great. We'll see you in the next video. Thank you.